Is it just me, or do the New Orleans Saints feel like one of those teams that has a bit of an identity crisis, or more so maybe a reality crisis, in terms of they're not very connected to their current reality? They think they are a lot closer than what they really are. They feel like they could do big things, and we know the reality is much, much different. They give Derek Carr a really big contract in free agency, and I'm like, why would you do that? You know, it's one of those things you have to ask yourself. It wasn't his fault, ultimately, all of it, but, you know, one of the reasons the Raiders weren't more successful during his 9 years as a starter for the Raiders was Derek Carr. He's not the sole blame. He's not even the primary blame, but he was a piece of the problem. And if the team they just played for 9 years was so willing to give up on him and let him go, then that should tell you something, especially when it comes to a guy at the most important position in North American professional sports. But the Saints apparently said, sign us up for that shit. And now they're a team that, yet again, is up against the salary cap, nowhere near being a contender, in my humble opinion. And then to top it all off, like, they didn't have a first-round pick in this year's draft of their own initially, due to other moves they made in last year's draft that were really questionable. Like, they're making a bunch of moves and doing a bunch of things like they're a team that's all in and ready to go for it now. And you just look at their roster and you say, there's no fucking way. Like, are you trying to win 8 or 9 games and hoping you can squeak out the NFC South so you can lose a home playoff game? Is that the fucking goal here? If there was any positive for them, is they took Sean Payton, who had retired, and allowed him to go to Denver, but in the process got a first-round pick back in return. So they got some type of draft pick capital there. Got something for nothing, basically. I do like how they turned that into Bryan Bresee at pick 29, because I look at him and I say at pick 29, you know, I watched him at Clemson and I said, it always feels like it's fucking something. He's got this injury, he's got this illness, he's got this thing happening off the field. It's always fucking something. But when he was on, and you could see the top 10 talent upside that exists in that young man. So, not only does he address a big need in the trenches defensively for the Saints, it's the type of upside play that this guy could vastly outplay his draft position. And they didn't have to move up, they didn't have to do anything. They just let it fall to them. So I really like what they did here with Bresee at 29 and gave him a B- for that. And then day 2, started with a continual focus on the defensive trenches. You know, I had Isaiah Foskey as a late kind of first-round talent, so they were able to stay put and get him at 40. That's pretty good. And now you're talking about you're bringing in 2 guys on your defensive line that can get after the quarterback, and Bresee and Foskey. I like what they did here. I really, really did. And I love the pick of Kendre Miller in round 3, because he should be able to contribute and could serve to be Kamara's long-term replacement. I could see him playing some type of a similar role there. So another solid effort for the Saints on day 2. Then you get to day 3 and they make the big move up the board, giving up a 5th rounder, pick 165, to move up 12 spots to take Nick Saldiveri, the offensive lineman from Old Dominion. You gave up a 5th rounder to move up 12 spots to get this guy. You better hope he's a starter by some point in 2023 and 2024. Otherwise, what the fuck were you doing here? Interesting, nonetheless. They spent a 4th round pick on Jake Haener. That was strange to me. There were better quarterbacks on the board at that point. You just gave a ton of money to Derek Carr. As far as I know, you still have Jameis Winston. You still have Taysom Hill. Why are you burning this 4th round pick on Jake Haener here? It just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me for a variety of reasons. To me, Jake Haener was more of like a 7th round priority free agent type of guy. And you're taking him in the heart of round 4. You just basically spent a 4th round pick on a backup that could have potentially been invested in giving more help to the quarterback you just paid a shit ton of money to bring in. I did not like the approach here. I did not like them taking Haener at that spot. I do look at Jordan Howden and I say he could crack the safety rotation. Whether he's a long-term starter or not, that might be a bit ambitious there. And then I look at A.T. Perry. He was somebody that, going into the 2022 college season, I thought, had a chance to become a day 2 pick with this size, and it just didn't materialize at Wake Forest, right? But at this point in the draft, you're talking about round 6. He's the type of guy that's worth a flyer. You may never really hear from him again. He might not do much, but it's worth a gamble. It's worth a chance. And by God, the Saints needed some help at wide receiver, so maybe he gets a chance to contribute something. As this is a Saints organization over the years that's been able to find some guys on day 2 and day 3 at wide receiver that have been able to come in and contribute. When I look at this draft overall for the Saints, though, would you rather have Bryan Bresee or would you rather have Sean Payton? They made the best out of the situation, but, But they did get the first-round pick in return for a coach. I wasn't going to come back to coach for him, so that's turning a negative into a positive. They double-dipped on the defensive line in the first 2 days of the draft, which made sense. It's a big need for them. Although I would turn around and say, hey, why don't you invest in tight end in this draft class, which was pretty deep at that position? Why don't you invest in wide receivers? You could certainly probably use a dynamic slot option. There were tons of those guys. A.T. Perry in round 6 ain't that type of fucking dude. I like them taking Miller in round 3 to be a backup to Kamara and potentially replace him in 2024. At some point in time, the salary cap chickens, eggs of the New Orleans Saints are going to have to come home to roost. Those chickens are going to have to come home to roost. And you're going to have to start replacing some of these players. You're going to have to start letting some guys go. And Miller might enable them to do that with Kamara in another 3. We'll see if day 3 brought them much of anything. But again, I take a look at the Saints here. And you're trading up, giving up a 5th-round pick in round 4 to take an offensive lineman when you're an organization that has invested a ton in recent years already on the offensive line. That's kind of questionable to me. You give Derek Carr a big contract, and as much as I like your first 2 draft picks of Bresee and Foskey, you invested your first 2 picks on the defensive side of the ball instead of investing in talent that could help the quarterback that you just paid a shit ton of money to. Now you can say, well, that was part of the problem with the Raiders. They didn't invest properly on the defensive side of the ball. That was always a big issue there, and I agree with that. But, it's like they targeted these defensive linemen and said, well, Derek Carr solves it, and it just doesn't. Like I said, I look at this draft, and I was a Saints fan. To me, it was like an average draft performance. There's some picks you could be excited about, especially on the first 2 days, but you look at the totality of it, it doesn't feel like it made much of a difference or is going to have much of an impact in the longer-term picture.